Hello, welcome to this special talk. There's a country in South Asia that has been in a post-conflict period except Nepal. That is also called the Pearl of Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka. And I have with us the professor. He is the CALD chairman and advisor on reconciliation to His Excellency the President of Sri Lanka. He is an MP, Professor Rajiva Wijesinha. Allow me to welcome to this special talk. You are welcome to this talk, sir.
Thank you very much for having me when I was in Nepal this week.
Thank you. And may we know the purpose of your visit to Nepal right now?
Well, it's actually for an NGO called SASEPS, the South Asia Center for Policy Studies, and they're discussing the SAARC Democracy Charter, but a citizens' initiative. And it's quite an interesting experience because we have people, academics, politicians from all over the SAARC countries, and we're exchanging ideas and trying to formulate something that could provide a basis for expanding and improving our democracies in this part of the world.
You're representing right now from Sri Lanka as a whole, or you have been invited as a guest?
No, they've just invited individuals.
Okay,
so I think they invited 3 or 4 people, but unfortunately 2 of us could be here. But it's a wide range of people, and we're representing our individual ideas, because I've done a lot of writing on political theory in Sri Lanka. I also produced a book called Liberal Perspectives for South Asia, which sadly didn't have someone from Nepal, but it included writings from Sri Lanka, India and Pakistan about developing a liberal democracy in this part of the world. Because, for too long we were all stuck in a sort of statist socialist concept of democracy. And I think it's important that we should all move intellectually as well as practically into a more suitable model for development.
So that's the pragmatic solution to democracy. So what do you think can be the right one?
Well, I think we've all been quite lucky in South Asia in recent years in moving towards democracy. Some countries had military dictatorships, you had a constitutional and then not so constitutional monarchy. India, I think, has been almost always democratic, but it took a long time for them to develop a multi-party system. And then Sri Lanka has always been democratic, except when we postponed elections in the 80s, but we've had constant changes of government. And I think it helps to keep people on their toes to know that they are responsible to the people.
So exactly after the promulgation of Sri Lankan Constitution in 1978.
Yeah.
So the political scenario which has passed all these years and back, I want to move into the conflict period right now. So you had been in one of the government official during the conflict period, and your experience as a Sri Lankan citizen and also as a government official. So how do you compare the situation in Sri Lanka over there in conflict period with that in Nepal?
Well, I think there is a slight difference in that within Sri Lanka, we had moved into, I think, efforts to alleviate the problems of the Tamil people, because certainly there were reasons for political unrest and a need for reform. We had, I would say, very insensitive language policies. But then unfortunately in the 80s, partly due to some authoritarian actions by the then Sri Lankan government, that was the government that postponed elections and actually completely stopped democracy for about 4 years. Instead of Tamil politicians, the strength passed to a terrorist movement. And the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam were actually quite ruthless terrorists, because they also eliminated all the other Tamil political parties. So that although in 1987 we had a settlement which I think could have taken the country forward, and all Tamil forces except the Tigers accepted the settlement. The Tigers turned it into a battle with India, and it got very, very ruthless, and they refused to negotiate for years. So that although we had a ceasefire agreement in 2002, it was very clear they weren't sincere, because they kept knocking off not government people but other Tamils. So I think ultimately the government that was elected in 2005 had to deal with them very, very firmly, but at the same time had to, and I think we have to keep affirming this, a commitment to the Tamil people who are distinct from the Tigers. Now I think the difference in Nepal is that when you actually move towards a peace situation, I think, as far as I know, all parties were sincere and actually stopped violence. And then, of course, you had this little interregnum when I think the king took authority into his own hands. But I think all parties came together to say, they preferred a movement towards consensus than
So
heavy-handedness.
the situation in Nepal is a lot more easier than that was in Sri Lanka.
I think so, because I think from what I know, the major political parties, although they have disagreements, as political parties must do, did not resort to underhand violence and terrorism, and indeed destroy the forces of moderation. In Sri Lanka, unfortunately, the Tamil Tigers were really more aggressive towards the moderate Tamil politicians, and that was a very difficult situation for everybody.
Especially when the peace process was on in Sri Lanka, there was a special debate whether the LTTE should be called terrorist or simply a political organization with definite demands. So even this issue was taken to high courts back there in Netherlands even. So finally, when the LTTE was eliminated right now, what are the feelings of Tamil people? So do they feel secure? Do they feel their rights to be secure?
Well, I think by and large, yes. I mean, I do a lot of travel in the northern areas. I think there's a distinction between what I would call the elite, which would like more political power, and we're in the process of negotiating. I'm on the team that's negotiating with the main political party in the Tamil areas. And then there's the people who really suffered under the Tigers. And they, I think, just want development, peace and prosperity. And it's quite interesting, at the recent local elections that we held, in the northernmost district, which had not been under the Tigers, there was more support for the opposition party, whereas in the Vanni, which was the area that was under the Tigers, because I think of the development, the government, although they didn't get a majority, got well over 40%, which is more than any Sri Lankan National Party has got in those areas. So I think we are moving towards integration, but I think we have to be very, very sensitive to the needs and aspirations of the Tamil people and make sure that there isn't a sense that, you know, now that we defeated the Tigers, we think we've won and there's no need for any more discussion. I think it's very important to keep talking, but to be also very, very firm that terrorism should not be allowed to rear its head again in Sri Lanka.
So what is the exact condition of the Tamil people right now?
Well, I think the people in the Vanni have almost all been resettled. We were very careful before we settled them to engage in demining, but also to make sure that the areas they went back to had basic amenities. So, for instance, the schools began almost at once. And, you know, Sri Lanka, even when the Tigers were controlling those areas, we paid for the schools, we sent the uniforms, we sent the books. So I think that is moving very well. I went and had a look at all the schools. The buildings are doing very well. The furniture, the uniforms, the books are there. We have to do much better on things like teacher training, because the people of that area did not get advanced education when the Tigers were there. And unfortunately, we have urban heavy elite, so that it's people from the cities that are the trained teachers, and they won't go and work in rural areas. So I think the solution is to do more intensive training for people from those areas. I think of the same problem in Nepal, where in your rural areas you may not have the best teachers. And I think the thing we need to do is to make sure that the young people from those areas get the benefits of education. I think we need to develop more entrepreneurship. You know, one of the big problems about all our countries, for a long time the idea was the state had to do everything, and therefore if the state didn't do everything there was a lot of bitterness. We need to make sure, and this is what liberalism is about, that the state should give the infrastructure and should give people opportunities and education and so on, but should facilitate their capacity to do business. Now we're doing very well on the infrastructure, but we need to, and the agriculture, because that area is very fertile, and now we're getting harvests from there, which is fantastic after, you know, many years of the Tigers not allowing that. But we should be training the young people there to do the business, to do the added value, to do the agribusiness. Also in things like construction, you know, when we're doing all the roads and so on, we should make sure that the young people there are able to participate. So in that area, human resources development, we need to do much, much more to make sure that there's full involvement of the people. So with regard to the former combatants, I think we've done an excellent job. I should actually show you some of these pictures, because there were lots of allegations that, you know, we treated them badly. But I've actually managed to show that we really did our best. For instance, this is when the people were displaced. And the minute we took them into the welfare centers, we started education. Primary education, secondary technical training, these are the hospitals and so on. So I think it's particularly important that the former combatants, for instance, were I think very well treated. We had about 11,000 of them, and we've now managed to release about 9,000. The more hardcore need longer rehabilitation, but we think most of them should be out as well by the end of this year.
Especially those who were internally displaced, exactly, because around 3 lakhs people, they had been displaced. So what's their situation right
Well,
now?
they're the ones I told you have gone back. We've actually resettled almost all of them. There's still 7,000 out of 3 lakhs, so that's pretty good.
Okay.
In the camp, the reason those are there is that that area is pretty heavily mined, but in fact we're trying to move them back as well within a couple of months. Certainly by the end of the year the camps will be closed. As I told you, of the people who went back initially, we made sure that they had basic infrastructure. When I went in 2009, which is when we began the resettlements, I couldn't obviously check on everything, but I did check on things like clean water, on education, on to make sure the schools were functioning, because these people want hope for the future.
You were satisfied with those?
The schools, as I said, were extraordinarily good. Water, we were doing well. Roads was moving well, but we could have done a bit more on some of them. The housing was very basic, but it was there. They had shelter. And of course, the important thing was we were ready to get them back when the monsoon started. And the harvest was good. So in that first year, we were actually able, this was 2009, to cultivate about 6,000 acres in that area, what's called the Rice Bowl. And then the next year, 2010, the rains begin September, October, we were actually able to go up to about 12,000. So now this year that we've moved into the eastern part of the Vani as well, we should be able to have a pretty good harvest, assuming the monsoon does, is regular. That's one of the problems we all face.
So are you implying that the high economic growth rate that Sri Lanka is catching up with right now in these years is all because of these policies that you have employed?
No, this was the only reason, because we kept our economy going very, very well right through even the war years. We had growth of 6 or 7%. We are helped, of course, by things like remittances. For instance, the Jaffna Peninsula, which is the Tamil area, which I told you was more sophisticated, has one of the highest GDP rates in Sri Lanka. But that is because of a lot of remittances from abroad. But this is where I think we need to work. I think Nepal needs to do the same, because we have a lot of migrant labor. But I think you are even worse than we are in this respect, that your people at the lowest level of migrant labor, they just get paid basic wages for labor. Whereas, for instance, what we should be doing when we send people to the Middle East to do technical jobs, driving, plumbing, electronics, carpentry, is also give them added value. Things like English, things like management skills, because then they start getting paid that little bit more. So that's why we're working with an NGO. I think they function in Nepal as well. It's called Aided Action. And they do extremely good vocational training. So that way we need to improve things. But certainly the rapid resettlement and the fact that we were able to work on agriculture straight away in 2009, 2010 has helped. So let me give you another little statistic. In 2009, the exams, the school exams, the North actually didn't do too well. But in 2010, those kids have done very well.
Okay.
So I think that shows that what we were trying to do in things like education has been working.
So you strongly believe that without the access of education to all the people all over the country, even in the conflict affected areas, the efforts of development would go on west?
Sorry?
Would get wasted. The efforts for development would get wasted without the development of education.
I think we must develop education, but Sri Lanka has always been very good. I think you're aware that we've had 90% literacy.
Yeah, that's right.
And we've kept that going even during the conflict. As I said, the Tamil areas were given uniforms. I remember one Westerner looked at me and said, "You've given them uniforms." I said, "Yes, these are our children. We give uniforms to all school children."
This is one of the things Nepal needs to learn, exactly.
Sorry?
This is one of the things Nepal needs to learn.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
The primary education and the facilities. But I think we also need to go further. We need to allow private enterprise to do education at the higher levels so that we have good university entry levels. The state cannot provide university education free for 100% of the people. At the moment we only take in about 20,000 free of charge. But there's another 40,000 who want education and deserve it. So we should be developing things like private universities. I mean, now some of our children come to Nepal to university, which of course is very nice, but they should be able to do it in Sri Lanka as well. Your children should be able to come to us so that we can encourage mutual exchanges, because our fees are much less than they would be in the West, and we shouldn't be spending so much money that goes outside the region. We should be helping each other by educational initiatives in which we do better.
Now I'd like to move into tourism. That is one of the leading contributors to your GDP, especially when I talked about tourism. Sri Lanka has also been celebrating tourism year this year, and Nepal coincidentally has also been celebrating the tourism year 2011. So as I talked to your ambassador today, he pointed out some of the possibilities of collaboration of the both countries in this development of tourism, especially when Nepal needs to learn of Sri Lanka about the tourism industry. What employments can be made in Nepal in tourism industry to take it as a major contributor in GDP?
Well, I think you have a wonderfully rich country for tourism. I think because of the conflict and so on, it hasn't been so good, and I think some of the infrastructure needs to be developed. We had the same problem with things like roads and transport and connectivity. We've been weak, so that in your case, you've either got the lowest end of the market, you know, people are prepared to travel in uncomfortable buses for long distances, or the highest end. We used to have that. I think what we've now done is develop a lot of middle class tourism. We're very, very pleased that some of the largest intakes in recent years to Sri Lanka have been from India, from China, from Japan, from the Middle East. I think you also need to expand that market. Of course, you know, the higher spending people come from Europe, and we need to provide facilities for that. But I think we could do a lot of work in mutual training, and I think we can develop facilities for hotels. We should be developing direct air links between our two countries. We used to have it, that stopped. I hope that will come around soon, because at the moment we take a long time to get to each other. But a link where, you know, either Nepal or Sri Lankan Airlines brings people for a couple of weeks in Colombo, in round the and then comes over here, would I think give a very full Asian experience.
So may I know all the sectors that do contribute greatly to the GDP of Sri Lanka?
Well, we have a lot actually. We used to, you know, don't forget agriculture. Our tea is still very important. Yeah. Our rubber has kept up.
It's a really famous tea.
And it really is fantastic tea. And we've actually diversified. We now have a lot of very, you know, in the old days we used to grow the tea, and the British made a lot of the profits. I think the same problem happened here.
Yeah.
But I think we all have to learn to do the added value ourselves. So we have very bright entrepreneurs who now have almost, I would say, not the monopoly, there's no question of that, but they have a large share of the market in Australia, in Southeast Asia and so on. Very exclusive teas. We have also diversified to the Middle East and to Russia, who have been some of our best customers and so on. So don't forget our agriculture is important. But of course we have the garment industry, and we had a bit of a problem when some of the Western powers tried to, you know, blackmail us and say they'll take away concessions if we didn't do what they told us to. And we said, you know, I'm sorry.
So especially when I talked about industries, you just mentioned the garment industry right now. Yeah. So in Nepal, we do have the problems of labor unions and the conflict between the labor unions and the usually the owners, the entrepreneurs. So what is the exact solution methodology that Sri Lanka has applied to keep these industries alive?
Well, I don't think we ever had quite the confrontation that you've had here. But I think one of the things that benefited us is the realization in Sri Lanka that we had to move to a private sector oriented economy, because that can be the only engine of growth. But we didn't lose our social services. So while we developed the private sector, we also made sure that, you know, things like employment rights, pension rights, what's called UPF, were kept going. And our labor conditions are pretty good. But within that framework, I think we've also encouraged greater communication and participation. You know, I think one of the problems in Nepal, I'm saying, going from when I tried to do this workshop for the German Liberal Foundation here some years back, there was a great dichotomy between a very rich capitalist class and the workers. And there wasn't that communication. And I think that needs to be encouraged. You know, a country needs to develop a middle class so that there can be more communication and less confrontation. So that's an area where, you know, the bunds in Nepal, I was due to come here 2 weeks ago, and they cancelled the meeting because of the bund. And I think that type of thing you have to work out a way of getting over, so that any disputes are settled by consultation. As I said, our garment industry did very well. We're doing higher value garments. We also have been moving into things like, you know, tourism was very large, then it went down, but we're moving back into that. But we have been diversifying our markets. Okay. And I think that has been particularly important. But one thing I shouldn't forget is our migrant labor. Okay. We get a lot from that, and we're doing our best to make the conditions better for them. I think we can take a leaf out of the book of the Philippines in that respect, and make sure that the people who go from Sri Lanka and earn for us actually looked after, and their families are enabled to contact them and so on.
Professor Rajiva, finally I would like to move on to the international concerns of human rights in Sri Lanka right now and some months back. So are the concerns of international community do you feel them justifiable?
Not in the slightest. You see, what happened in Sri Lanka is we had to fight a terrorist movement. I believe we fought it very cleanly. Some of the allegations against us are palpably false. I've done an actual study of this. It's available on my blog. For instance, there was a report which was meant to be an advisory report to the UN, which makes allegations that UN reports themselves falsify. For instance, they claim that we treated the people in the camps badly. As I said, you know, there were lots of pictures of the conditions in the camp. I mean, these are the kids in the camps and so on. But the really funny thing is they didn't ask the UN in Sri Lanka, because we have a letter from the UN head telling us, you know, I must congratulate the government because of its very prompt action together with the UN. We averted the humanitarian catastrophe that many predicted. And, you know, he details how we cut down malnutrition levels and so on. Again, there's a suggestion that we deliberately bombed hospitals. So I've been in very close discussion because I was Secretary of the Ministry of Human Rights.
Right.
I monitored every day when I ran the Peace Secretariat what appeared in Tamilnet. And I used to check on this. And many of the allegations coming out now were never heard in 2009. So, for instance, there was a British debate in the House of Commons, which was really rather sad because the MPs really said they were catering to their constituents. Most of it was a violent attack on India for what they called human rights violations in Kashmir. Then they had a little bit about Sri Lanka. And they talk, for instance, about thousands and thousands being killed. And I've just done an article, and I wrote to the British High Commissioner saying, you know, can't you tell these people not to tell lies?
So these are all totally biased allegations.
Well, they're palpably false, because if you look at the evidence, for instance, on the day he was talking about, the UN report says 23rd, the UN hub was shelled. There's another UN spokesman who says 22nd. There's a letter on the 24th from the head of security thanking the government for excellent cooperation. And, you know, the next day, the Tamilnet alleged 300 killed. The UN sent us a letter, having asked us during the day, they said, we have reports you're firing. The head of the UN sent us a letter saying, I had it on my SMS, it was an SMS, saying for information, we believe most of the firing came from the LTTE. So you see, these are a failure of looking at evidence. And one of the real problems we face is that there's a very strong lobby abroad of Tamil diaspora that supported the LTTE. Some British politicians, and I'm afraid a few Americans now, are giving in to pressure. The British confessed to the Americans, because the Americans initially under George Bush, you know, they were firm on terrorism. I think they couldn't understand why the British were being so silly. And, you know, David Miliband had said, you know, the Tamils have a lot of votes. So frankly, I think it's wickedness to engage in what could end up being support for terrorism simply because you want to win elections. On the other hand, that's natural for politicians all over. They want to win elections, they'll do anything, especially in countries like that, because the price of, you know, power is so great. So I think it's really rather sad that people should behave like that.
So if we talk in conclusion, Sri Lanka still stands strong for human rights protection.
Absolutely, we have to improve it. I mean, for instance, when I was secretary, I used to say we have to do much better with our police. I will stand up for our army and say that we really have improved the training. In the 80s, some, you know, problems happened. There's a case in the 90s that had to be prosecuted. But over the last 10 years, we've got better and better. I mean, I'm not saying individuals don't do bad things, but the principles have been inculcated very well. And frankly, we have a much better record than the type of thing that's happening in Afghanistan, Iran. You know, it's just appalling. The drone strikes on civilians. You know, of course, they think their terrorists are so dangerous, they're allowed to do anything they like. But when we have to deal with our terrorists, no, let them, you know, do whatever they like. So it really is a bit vicious. But with our police, we have to do better training, because police over the war, they were neglected because we had to put a lot of resources into army training. So we've been advocating a lot of human rights and professional training for the police, and now we're able to move on that. We also need to do, very importantly, greater integration and involve the Tamils much more in the army and the police. They were always recruited to the police, but because of the LTT they were frightened, because the LTT used to kill Tamil policemen. But with the army, for obvious reasons we couldn't, we used to get them in the cadet corps, we need to expand that. So there are areas we must do better. But by and large, I think we can be very proud of our record in defeating terrorism.